The bullet wasn't meant for her. That's the part nobody ever talks about. How Clara Whitfield wasn't supposed to be standing there at all. She was supposed to be in the kitchen, refilling the water pitchers, doing the invisible work that keeps a gala running, while the powerful people inside it forget you exist. But she'd stepped out into the corridor at exactly the wrong moment, and she'd seen the boy standing alone by the window. And then she'd seen the man raising his arm at the end of the hall. She didn't think. There wasn't time to think. She moved. 3 shots. She remembered counting them, which was strange, the way your brain catalogues things in a crisis that have no business being catalogued. 1 caught her in the shoulder. The 2nd tore through her side. The 3rd, the one that would nearly kill her, went clean through her back, just left of her spine. She found out later that the boy's name was Theo. He was 7 years old, and he was wearing a clip-on tie because his father had told him this was an important evening, and he needed to look like a gentleman. He had his father's dark eyes and his late mother's stubborn jaw, and when Clara fell on top of him to shield him from the gunfire, the first thing he said, the very first thing, before the screaming started in the ballroom behind them, was, "Are you okay?" 7 years old, and his first instinct was to ask if she was okay. That was the moment, though she wouldn't understand it for months, when everything in Clara's life began to change. She'd taken the job 3 weeks earlier out of desperation, not ambition. Her brother, Jamie, was 22 and had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 19. The kind of bad luck that arrives without warning and then stays forever. In Canada, insulin was covered, barely, through a patchwork of programs that required constant renewal and paperwork and phone calls to people who put you on hold for 40 minutes and then disconnected. Jamie lived with her in their small apartment in East Vancouver. He worked part-time at a hardware store and spent the rest of his hours trying not to feel like a burden, which he was not, but which Clara knew he felt anyway. She'd been a server at a mid-range restaurant downtown. Good tips on weekends, inconsistent during the week, never quite enough. When the catering company reached out about a high-end private event, 3 times her usual nightly rate, she'd said yes before the sentence was finished. The gala was held at a private estate in West Vancouver, perched above the city with a view that Clara had no time to appreciate. She wore the standard black and white uniform, kept her dark hair pinned back, and moved through the evening like a ghost. Efficient, invisible, unnoticed. She noticed plenty, though. She noticed that the security at the door was unusually heavy for what had been billed as a charity fundraiser. She noticed that several of the men in attendance wore their jackets cut in a specific way, tailored not just for appearance but for concealment. She noticed that one man in particular sat at the center table and received every other person who approached him like a king accepting petition, never rising from his chair, never smiling. Adrian Caruso. She didn't know the name that night. She learned it later in the hospital when a man in a grey suit sat down beside her bed and told her, in a voice with very little warmth in it, exactly how much trouble she was in. Adrian Caruso was 41 years old. He was the head of a private security and asset management firm that operated across Western Canada and had interests in real estate, shipping, and several other ventures that no one talked about openly at dinner parties. He was, depending on who you asked, either a very successful businessman with a complicated past or the most dangerous man between Vancouver and Toronto. He had been widowed 4 years ago. He had a son. She'd saved the son, and the man in the grey suit, who introduced himself only as Mr. Holt and did not specify who he worked for, told her this while she was still attached to 2 IV lines and running a fever from a post-surgical infection, that she had witnessed the face of a professional contract killer in the moments before and after the shooting, and that this made her, in certain circles, a liability. "What does that mean?" Clara asked. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Mr. Holt looked at the window instead of at her. "It means we need to determine the best way to keep you safe," he said, "while certain matters are resolved." "I'm a caterer," she said. "I'm not. I don't know anything about anything. I barely got a look at him." "You got a look." She had. In the corridor, in the fraction of a second before she moved, she'd seen his face clearly enough. Sharp jaw, pale scar at the left temple. She would have recognized him in a lineup. She didn't say any of this to Mr. Holt. "Mr. Caruso," he continued, "has proposed an arrangement." Clara waited. "For your safety and for certain logistical reasons that Mr. Caruso is prepared to explain in person, he is proposing that you move into the Caruso residence for the duration of the investigation. In a formal capacity." Mr. Holt paused. "As his wife." Clara stared at him. "I understand this sounds insane," she said. "This sounds insane." "It sounds unconventional," Mr. Holt agreed, mildly. "But Mr. Caruso is prepared to compensate you very generously. Ensure your brother receives full private medical coverage for the next 3 years and guarantee your safety during what may be a dangerous period. In return, he asks for 6 months of your presence at his residence. Public appearances, where necessary. Enough credibility to satisfy the social circles he operates in. Clara looked at the ceiling. The IV in her left arm itched. Her back felt like someone had replaced her spine with a length of hot wire. He declared me his wife, she said slowly. In front of people. In front of approximately 240 people, yes. It was the fastest way to establish a reason for why he would ensure your survival and recovery, and to signal to certain parties that you were untouchable. And if I say no? Mr. Holt was quiet for a moment. Mr. Caruso would still ensure your safety to the best of his ability, but his ability to do so would be considerably more limited if you were not under his roof. She thought about Jamie. She thought about the stack of insulin prescription renewals on their kitchen counter that needed to be submitted by the end of the month. She thought about the look on Theo's face, "Are you okay?" And about the 3 holes currently in her body, and about the fact that she didn't even know the name of the man who'd put them there. 6 months, she said, 6 months, and my brother gets private coverage, full, including hospital. Mr. Caruso has already arranged it. Clara closed her eyes. Tell him I said fine. The Caruso residence was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Something cold, maybe. Something that looked like the inside of a fortress. What she found instead was a large but not ostentatious house in West Vancouver, set back from the road behind tall cedars, with a wide front porch and a view of the inlet from the upper floors. It was the kind of house that had been lived in, not just decorated. Theo's drawings were stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like maple leaves. There was a dog-eared novel on the entryway table. The kitchen smelled like someone had burned toast that morning and hadn't entirely managed to cover it up. She arrived 12 days after the shooting, moving carefully because the incision in her back still pulled when she turned too quickly, and a woman named Mrs. Albrecht showed her to a room on the 2nd floor that was quiet and faced the trees. Adrian Caruso met her in the hallway. She'd seen him at the gala, only at a distance. Up close, he was taller than she'd estimated, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a softer way when he was younger and had since settled into something harder and more interesting. He had dark circles under his eyes that she suspected were permanent. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in years and had made his peace with it. "Clara," he said. Not Ms. Whitfield, just Clara, as though they'd met before. "Mr. Caruso," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a flinch, but close. "Adrian," he said. "In this house, at least, I'd prefer Adrian," she agreed. They stood in the hallway for a moment, both of them apparently having run out of things to say. And then Theo appeared at the top of the stairs in sock feet and a dinosaur sweatshirt, and the tension broke like a window. "You're the lady who saved me," he announced. He said it with the flat certainty of a 7-year-old stating a fact. "The sky is blue, grass is green. You saved my life." "I am," Clara said. He came down the stairs carefully, one step at a time, watching her. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "A little less every day." He considered this with great seriousness. "My dad got shot in the leg once," he said, in the tone of someone sharing a relevant credential. "He says it felt like being stung by a really angry bee, except worse." Clara glanced at Adrian. "He's not wrong," Adrian said. "I'll take your word for it," she said. Theo nodded, apparently satisfied, and then went back upstairs to do whatever it was that 7-year-olds did on Tuesday afternoons. Clara watched him go and felt something she hadn't expected, something soft and unexpected, settle in her chest. She told herself it was just relief. She'd protected the boy. He was okay. That was the whole story. She was not great at telling herself things, it turned out. The first 2 weeks were formal and uncomfortable in the way that all new arrangements are formal and uncomfortable, when they require 2 strangers to pretend convincingly to be in love in front of a rotating cast of observers. Adrian's associates came and went. His lawyer, a compact, precise woman named Ms. Ewan, who looked at Clara with an expression of professional assessment, reviewed the paperwork with them both, and explained the terms in language that left no room for misunderstanding. At one of these early meetings, a visiting associate of Adrian's named Mr. Ferretti made a point of grioning Clara with an attention that bordered on deliberate, the kind of attention designed to see if she'd step back. She didn't. She met his eyes and shook his hand and said it was lovely to meet him in a tone that conveyed the exact opposite, and afterward she caught Adrian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't flinch," he said when Ferretti had gone. "Should I have?" "Most people do. I've been flinching at things my whole life," Clara said. "I got a bit tired of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something that might, in other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile appeared briefly at the corner of his mouth and disappeared again. "There are rules," he said when they were alone. "People who work for me, their families are off limits." Anyone I'm associated with is, by extension, protected. What about children? Clara asked. If family is protected, why was Theo? Adrian's expression went flat and very still. Because the man who ordered the contract believed I didn't consider Theo family, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without inflection, the kind of quiet that came from keeping something very large, very tightly contained. He was wrong. Clara didn't press, but she filed it away. She learned the house gradually, the way you learn any place you're not sure you belong in, by moving carefully through it, noticing what was where, understanding its rhythms. Mrs. Albrecht managed the household with quiet efficiency. There were 2 men on the property at all times, politely present, professionally invisible. The dog, a large, good-natured lab named Hudson, had apparently decided that Clara was his new favorite person and followed her from room to room with absolute democratic devotion. Theo was in 2nd grade at a school 20 minutes away. He was picked up and dropped off by a driver named Gus, who had the build of someone who had once been very dangerous and had since channeled that energy into being very reliable. Theo talked constantly in the car, Gus reported, and almost not at all in class, and his teacher had sent home a note suggesting he might benefit from more social interaction, which Adrian had read 3 times and folded very precisely and placed on his desk without saying anything. Clara found it there one afternoon. "Can I?" she asked. He gestured at it. She read it. "He's probably fine," she said. "Some kids just think more than they talk. It doesn't mean something's wrong." His mother was like that, Adrian said. He said it without looking up from what he was reading. Flat matter of fact, like he'd had 4 years to practice saying it without it wrecking him and was mostly there. She used to say she was conducting internal research. That's a good way to put it, Clara said. He looked up then, just briefly. "Yes," he said. "It was." She left the note on his desk and went to start dinner because Mrs. Albrecht had the afternoon off, and Clara had discovered, in the 3 weeks since arriving, that cooking was one of the few things that made the house feel like something she actually lived in, rather than a place she was temporarily stored. It was a Wednesday night when everything shifted. Theo had a nightmare. Clara heard him through the wall, a sharp cry, then silence, then a small, frightened sound that she recognized as the specific misery of a child trying not to wake anyone up. She was out of bed before she'd consciously decided to move, across the hall, opening his door. He was sitting up in bed, blanket clutched to his chest, eyes wide and wet. "Hey," she said softly, "I've got you. It's okay." She sat on the edge of his bed. He leaned against her without asking, which was the kind of trust that costs children more than adults realize. And she put her arm around him carefully and told him about the time when she was 9 and had a nightmare about a washing machine that came to life and started eating the neighbors' cars, which was objectively ridiculous, and Theo laughed. A small, watery, very real laugh, and after a few minutes his breathing evened out. She didn't hear Adrian in the doorway. She only realized he was there when he said her name, very quietly, and she turned and the look on his face stopped her completely. He looked. Undone was the only word she could find for it later. Not angry, something older and rawer than anger, like a man who has been keeping himself together through force of will for 4 years and has just seen something that has temporarily exceeded his ability to maintain it. "Adrian," she said. "It's me. Theo had a nightmare. I know." His voice was rough. "I heard." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and she could see him pulling himself back together, piece by piece, that careful reassembly that she'd watched him perform every day since she arrived. Then, he came in and sat on the other side of Theo's bed, and the 3 of them stayed like that until the boy fell asleep again. And in the dark and quiet of that room, Clara felt something she had no good name for and didn't try to name. The investigation moved slowly, the way these things do when they involve people who are very careful about leaving evidence. Clara knew she was a piece of it. She'd given a description to Mr. Holt's associates in the first week, and they'd confirmed it matched someone whose name she wasn't told. She didn't ask, but she was watching, the way she always watched, because she was a woman who'd moved through the world by paying careful attention to the things other people overlooked. And at a dinner, one of the mandatory social appearances that came with her new role, she noticed something. A man named Mr. Brecken had been introduced to her as an old associate of Adrian's, one of the founding investors in the original business some years back. He was silver-haired and gregarious and laughed loudly at his own jokes. He wore a signet ring on his right hand, gold, heavy with an unusual setting, a geometric pattern she'd seen once before. She'd seen it in the corridor, on the shooter's hand, in the second before she moved. She sat with this knowledge through the entire dinner. She held it very carefully, the way you hold something that can break if you grip it too tightly or drop it if you hold it too loosely. She smiled. She made conversation. She passed the bread. When the guests had gone and Adrian was standing at the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't drunk, she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned. "The ring," she said. "Mr. Brecken's ring, the geometric pattern on the setting." Adrian was completely still. "I saw it," Clara said, "that night, before I moved." The silence in the room was total and absolute. Adrian set down his glass with a precision that she recognized as the physical equivalent of keeping his voice level. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain." He looked at her for a long moment. And then, quietly, slowly, with the care of someone who had not done it in a very long time and wanted to get it right, he said, "Clara, thank you." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't the kind of moment that announces itself as significant. But something in the way he said it, the way his voice dropped on her name, the weight he put on two simple words, made her feel as though she had been seen, entirely and clearly, for the first time in years. The next weeks moved quickly. There were quiet conversations with Mr. Holt. There were meetings she wasn't included in and wasn't supposed to be. There was a morning when 3 men she'd never seen before arrived at the house before 7 and left within an hour, and Adrian spent the rest of the day in his office with the door closed. Mr. Brecken was taken into custody on a Thursday. She learned this from Gus, who told her with the satisfied brevity of a man who felt the information had been earned. The official version involved financial irregularities and a witness who had come forward. The unofficial version she understood without anyone explaining it. It was over, and with it over, the 6 months she'd agreed to, the arrangement, the careful performance of a life she didn't quite live had run its course. She sat in the kitchen with Hudson's head on her foot and thought about the apartment in East Vancouver, which she'd sublet. She thought about Jamie, who was doing well, better than well, with the coverage that had come through 2 months in, the kind of coverage where he'd stopped counting his supplies and started just using them when he needed to. She thought about what came next. Adrian found her there. He sat down across from her without asking, which she'd noticed he'd started doing, sitting down in the kitchen, having tea, staying longer than the conversation strictly required. Hudson relocated from her foot to his. "Theo asked me something this morning," he said. "Okay." He asked if you were going to stay. She looked at her mug. "I told him I didn't know," Adrian said, "that it was up to you. That was honest. I try." He paused. "I told him that what you did that night wasn't something I knew how to properly thank someone for. That some things don't have a sufficient answer." He turned his glass slightly on the table, a habit she'd noticed when he was choosing words carefully. "I told him that I hoped you'd want to stay, but that wanting something doesn't give you the right to it." Clara looked up. "He's never smiled like that before," Adrian said quietly. "Not since his mother. That first morning you were at breakfast and you made that terrible joke about the toast. It wasn't a terrible joke." He laughed, Adrian continued, and something in his voice was very close to breaking, except that it didn't break. It held. He laughed, and it was the first time in 4 years I've seen his face do that, and I didn't know what to do with it except think that I would do anything at all, to make sure he kept doing it. Clara set her mug down. "I'm not good at this," Adrian said. "Asking for things, saying what I mean without the professional distance of it. I've been keeping people at a certain radius for a long time, and I recognize that I don't have any particular right to ask you to change your plans." "Adrian," Clara said. He stopped. "I didn't actually have plans," she said. "I was figuring it out." He looked at her. "I was always figuring it out," she said. "I've been figuring it out my whole life. The difference is..." She paused, surprising herself with the honesty of what she was about to say. "The difference is that for the past 4 months I've been figuring it out in a house where someone asks me how I'm doing and actually waits for the answer. And there's a kid upstairs who shows me his drawings before he shows anyone else, and a dog who I've apparently adopted without anyone formally consulting me about it." Hudson's tail moved. "And you," she said, "who is frustrating and careful and sometimes so far inside your own head that I can't reach you. And Clara, genuinely the most stubborn man I've ever met. Clara, yes. Would you consider staying?" He said it simply, with the directness of someone who has stripped away all the scaffolding around what they actually mean, not as an arrangement, not as a transaction. Just you, here, if you want to be. She thought about the way the house smelled in the morning. She thought about Theo's face when she'd read him 3 chapters of Charlotte's Web last Tuesday, because one wasn't enough. She thought about the way Adrian had looked in that doorway in the dark. Undone and real and more human in that moment than she'd imagined him capable of being. "I'd need to talk to Jamie," she said. "He'll have opinions. I'd expect him to. And I want to be useful," she said. "I'm not good at being ornamental." "You've never been ornamental," Adrian said quietly. "Not once, from the moment you stepped in front of that bullet." She looked at him for a long moment. Across the kitchen, Hudson had gone to sleep. "Okay," she said. Okay, I'll stay. Slow and complicated, and entirely unguarded, the face of a man who had been holding something clenched for so long that letting go of it felt strange in his hands. Thank you, he said, like he'd said it once before. With the same weight. Her name wasn't in it this time, but the way he looked at her when he said it meant the same thing. Clara wrapped her hands around her mug and looked out at the cedars through the kitchen window, at the January light coming pale and gold through the trees, at the ordinary morning of an extraordinary life she hadn't planned and hadn't expected, and was, she realized, entirely ready to live.